account, contact, and case. In a typical REST API world, to retrieve this data, you would need 3 endpoints, each of which you call based on what you need. This works well with one caveat. When you call, for example, the contact endpoint by ID, you receive all fields visible to your user, but most likely you'll need only a small subset of them. This is called overfetching, retrieving more data than necessary. It can lead to increased response times and unnecessary load on both the client and server sides. Not good. So most likely, you'll call the following endpoint, where you pass a SQL query specifying only the fields you need. That looks better, but let's add to this formula a front-end developer, Lana. She has no knowledge of SQL, has no idea, and very often she needs deeply nested data, and every time she needs some specific data, she turns to the backend developer to provide her with the necessary functionality. How nice would it be if Lana could get the data she needs without those cumbersome interactions? Wait. She can. Introducing the query language GraphQL. Now Lana has a single endpoint, PostGraphQL, that can return any dataset of any nesting and complexity. As a front-end developer, she knows this language perfectly, and now instead of using hundreds of those different endpoints in REST API and communicating with backend developers, she can freely write any query from the UI and get the data. Good. But what about Salesforce? We don't split developers into backend developers and front-end developers, so what really prevents you from creating the new Apex controller method that returns the necessary data and which you call from Lightning Web Component? Well, actually nothing. Not only this is the most obvious solution, but in most cases it is the most correct one. Because if you go the GraphQL route, your Lightning Web Component might potentially look something like this. This GraphQL query is currently very static. All these lines of code are practically impossible to separate somewhere else. And yeah, in this case you don't actually need an Apex controller, because you can get any data without it. But this wire adapter looks just awful, and if you're hoping for sort of imperative call, it's not supported at the moment. And although there are good ideas that Salesforce promises to introduce soon and which I really hope for, let's focus on what we have right now and talk about a dynamic data retrieval requests. This sounds like the most reasonable topic to talk about. Let's say you're building some kind of custom component for searching data. User specifies criteria, hits search, and you get the data. I've never been a fan of passing all those strings to Apex, building a dynamic query there, and returning the data back. So GraphQL sounds like a reasonable alternative here. You can get the data, you can query the data from the UI without all these weird manipulations between the UI and the controller. Back to our Find the Guilty application. Here, at the time of configuring the review process record and after the user has specified the record type and filters and clicked Save, I want to present him with a preview of the records that fall under the criteria he specified. These criteria, which he selected earlier, are represented as a JSON structure, and I can certainly pass this JSON to the newly created Apex controller, process everything there, and return the result as a list of records. But GraphQL sounds more attractive to me. I don't want to create any Apex method. So in my Lightning Web Component, at the top, let's import JQL, which is the literal to mark GraphQL queries, and GraphQL, which is kind of endpoint, from UI GraphQL API. And now let's create a new wire adapter. That's really the only place where you can use it, wire adapter. And here we specify GraphQL as the endpoint that we will call to get a data. And now here in the query attribute, we have to pass the GraphQL query. So it would seem like a good idea right here to create some kind of custom getter, which dynamically creates the GraphQL query based on our JSON conditions. So here I'll create GraphQL with all conditions I need, and of course following the standard of how it's supposed to be structured. And what is no less important here, since GraphQL positions itself as a tool that allows you to get exactly what you need, exactly those fields you need and nothing more, I'll specify exactly the fields that I need. The problem is that this all stuff will not work. Your query must be marked with the literal JQL that we imported earlier, so ideally it should look like this. You do have some kind of string, and before you mark it with the literal JQL to let determine that it is actually the GraphQL query. And you know what? It would seem that this is not a problem either. So what I can do in our getter is that I can return the result of this here in the form of return JQL literal, and after that query, why not? And only then pass it to the wire adapter. But you know what? This will not work either. The thing is, GraphQL cannot accept dynamically interpolated strings. That is, any dynamism is actually blocked. You must specify the query right here in the wire adapter as statically as it can be, like this, mark it with a literal, and only then it will work. Our idea has failed. Predictability. This is what you'll be surrounded by when working with GraphQL. You must clearly understand what user wants, what he might ask for in a particular component. And it's important to note that although it looks like completely static, it's not. You have the ability to specify variables for your query. For example, if you have Lightning Web component where users can select the account name, you are able to take the account name and pass into the GraphQL query dynamically. That is allowed. There is an interesting publication called You Probably Don't Need GraphQL, a link to which I'll leave in the description, and which describes the challenges when GraphQL can be useful. This article is remote from the Salesforce world, and therefore the points mentioned here really make sense. But back to the argument that as Salesforce developers, we do have full control over the system. We don't need to run around and ask someone to create the Apex controller method for us. We do it ourselves. But don't get me wrong, GraphQL has its advantages. For complex queries, it definitely has its advantages. Also, your component might then look like some kind of stored procedure, but nevertheless. Finally, ask yourself one question. Is your use case really the use case that involves GraphQL in LWC? Or maybe it's not. See you soon.